Okay, welcome everybody to today's lecture about Nietzsche. This is part of my philosophy course. I've done some other videos about Spinoza and a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers and Stoicism and Epicureanism. So if you're into philosophy, please check out those lectures, I suppose, or classes or discussions on old philosophers. We're moving on to Nietzsche today. And he's someone who is very often misinterpreted, I think. And I think that's partly Nietzsche's fault. If you look at a lot of his books, he writes a lot of aphorisms. He writes a lot of paragraphs, really, where he talks about one topic and then about another topic and then about another topic. And it means it's very hard to find a system in his philosophy. But I want to show that he does have a system. And to do that, I'm going to use the book in which he shows his, in which he talks about his philosophy in a very systematic way. And that is On the Genealogy of Morality. So if you want to have a look for this book online, you can find it very easily. Just type in Genealogy of Morality PDF, and you'll be able to find a copy of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. I really recommend the Keith Ansel Pearson version. He's got a nice clear essay at the start of the text, and there's some excellent supplementary material at the end from some of Nietzsche's other books, which talk about things that he mentions in the Genealogy of Morality. So it's a very good book, this particular one. If you're starting to read about Nietzsche, if you're starting to read his work, I really recommend starting with something like the Genealogy first. One of his books where he's actually writing in an essay format. It just makes it a lot easier to see where he's coming from. So I really recommend starting with the Genealogy of Morality, and not something like Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is really poetic and very difficult to understand if it's your first book. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention first. Secondly, he has a very different style of writing to say, the previous philosopher Spinoza. Spinoza writes in a very direct way, and I think it's much easier to see clearly what Spinoza is saying. I think it's a little bit more difficult with Nietzsche. However, with the Genealogy of Morality, he makes himself very clear. So let's talk about what he discusses in this book. Now, this is a book very much about ethics. The last book we looked at was called Ethics by Spinoza, but the majority of that book actually talks about epistemology and ontology. It discusses problems of the mind and the body and the structure of existence, and only in the last two chapters does it start to move on to ethics. But it was a very important question for Spinoza, and it's a very important question for Nietzsche, ethics. It's really what Nietzsche talks about most of the time. And so Nietzsche asks us, what is the value of values? He wants to know what the value is of having an ethical system. Does it have any value? And what kind of values does it have? What kind of, how can we interpret a moral system? And so he doesn't seem to like, he talks about some other people who he calls the English psychologists, and he doesn't like their genealogy of morality, because the English psychologists have explained where they believe morals come from. And really, he's talking about the social Darwinists. We have had a lot of people in England who have tried to explain the origin of morality from a Darwinistic viewpoint, from a Darwinistic perspective. And so they try to explain how morals have evolved slowly over time, how altruistic behaviour has evolved, and they try to do it in terms of evolution, in terms of Darwinism. And he gives an example of this. He says that these English psychologists, they usually find the origin of morality in utility, in usefulness. They say that morality is useful for mankind, and this is why it's developed. They suggest that good acts were first praised by the recipient of the good act, as useful, And after a while, it became a habit to carry out good acts because they were praised. And in the end, you felt that you were doing something good yourself, even though at the beginning, in the origin, it was only the recipient that called the act good. Now, Nietzsche found this story highly unconvincing. Yeah, he thought it was absolutely wrong, that this was not where morality came from. He had some very different ideas about where morality came from, and he thought that this was particularly naive. In particular, I've underlined this word, the recipients. They say that something is good because the recipient feels it as good, and so the recipient is the one that labels the action good first of all. And it's only over time, after it becomes a habit, that the doer of the action feels the action as good. Now, Nietzsche found this particularly ridiculous. He was absolutely certain that if you looked back in time, and you should remember that Nietzsche was a classical scholar, he was an expert on ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and he loved, reading all of those old books. And he thought that he had found something in Greek and Roman culture which wasn't around in the Judeo-Christian world. It wasn't here. And it was a system of morals. So for Nietzsche, the origin of morality, morality was formed when a superior class of individuals, you could call them the masters, you could call them active people, he calls them artists, he calls them a number of different things, but he means a strong group of people went around, and because they were stronger, they subjugated an inferior class of people. Now, this is very important in Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, any kind of body, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a physical body or a legal body, a state body, an institution, but any kind of body is always composed of two different types of forces. And these two different types of forces are always battling against each other. And one force will be a dominating force, let's call that the superior force, and one force will be the dominated force, that's the inferior force. And so this is where Nietzsche believes that morality started. He believes that a group of people who were stronger than other people went around, and what they did was impose their will on other people. Now, what he's really thinking of here are tribes of people who gathered people together and formed them into states, into, say, city-states. Now, of course, this was a very big change for mankind. The first time that we started coming together in groups and forming city-states, Nietzsche doesn't believe that this was a nice, friendly agreement between a bundle of different people, who all came along, shook hands and said, let's live together in a city and it will be much easier for everybody. He doesn't believe it happened like that. He believes that it happened in a very cruel and harsh way, and I think he's a realistic guy for this reason. He believes that a group of cruel, violent, aggressive people subjugated people into a city, and the ones in charge, the superior ones, were the masters, let's call them the masters, and they were the ones who invented the good. Not the recipient of the good, but they invented the good. Now, Nietzsche is a big fan of etymology. He looks at the history of words, and he's convinced that if you look for the history of the word good, you'll find that it means aristocratic, noble, master, the pure, the ones who are in charge, basically. They call themselves good, and that's how morality starts. It starts with an affirmation. It starts with the masters affirming themselves as the good ones, the pure ones, the strong ones, the ones who are in charge. And as a secondary thought, as an afterthought, an aside, it's just an afterthought, the others, the slaves, are bad. In the sense that they're not good, they're not as powerful, they're weaker, they're not as powerful as the ruling ones. Okay, and he does this all by etymology. Etymology is something he is fascinated in, and it comes up several times in the genealogy of morality, and it's where he has this idea that the origin of morality, it began in really cruel and violent conditions, and it was when we were forced together to live in city-states. Now do remember that this is a massive change for mankind when this happened. Think about how many of even simple biological processes had to suddenly be contained, and certain instincts had to be controlled and guided in completely new directions. People were not allowed to express their instincts in the same way that they would have been before they were forced together into these city-states. But Nietzsche sees something healthy about this, and certainly something interesting for the future. It has negative consequences and positive consequences, and we'll look at some of the negative ones in a second. But this is where Nietzsche believes morality began. It began when a superior class of masters exerted themselves, and it's something that they can't help. You shouldn't think that this is as cruel as perhaps modern man might believe it to be. It was just they were powerful beings, and this is what they did. Okay, let's perhaps move on to then the slaves' revolt in morality, because over time Nietzsche believed that this moral system where the good affirmed themselves, and only as an afterthought did we have the bad. And Nietzsche certainly contrasts the good with the bad here. Not good with evil, but the good with the bad. And he says that the strong just affirmed themselves as good, and it was a secondary thought that the others were bad. And so bad meant pleb, slave, inferior, that kind of thing. But it was just an afterthought. Now, of course, the slaves perhaps didn't like this, and their revenge was to negate the others. But this was their first thought. It wasn't an affirmation like it was with the masters. It was a negation of the others, the masters, as evil. That was their first thought, that these masters are evil, and as an afterthought, they themselves are the good. Now, this is a reversal in the first moral system. Notice that the first moral system starts with an affirmation, and only as an afterthought does it have a negation. But this moral system starts with a negation. The slaves negate the masters, and they negate their way of life as evil. Yeah, they believe it to be evil, and only as an afterthought are they, therefore, the good ones. Now, how do they manage this? How do they manage to do this reversal of the moral system? The system of values seems to be reversed here from affirmation to negation. Well, they get this revenge on the masters in an imaginary way. Nietzsche is quite careful to say that when the slaves revolt in morality, these forces, these reactive forces, because remember that the world is composed of active and reactive forces for Nietzsche, dominant forces and dominated forces. And the battle between the two of them are constantly changing, which is why he doesn't believe that life ever stands still. But everything involves forces fighting with other forces, and sometimes some forces are victorious, but sometimes the weaker forces are victorious, which is why Nietzsche actually is famous for saying the strong should be protected from the weak. It's an idea which I find fascinating. And yeah, so sometimes reactive forces will get the better of active forces, and this is what's happening here. The slaves are getting the better of the masters, the reactive forces are getting the better of the active forces, and they do this without being more powerful than the active forces. According to Nietzsche, they never get more powerful than the active forces, but they're victorious because they separate the active forces from what they can do. They stop the active forces from being able to express themselves. Now, what does he mean? Well, he says that they create a fiction. They create something which is totally imaginary, the reactive forces, in order to stop active force from doing what it can do. Now, he tells a little story here about birds of prey and lambs. And he explains why this reversal of the system of values, where you negate the others as